Along in May, our intelligence notified us that the Navy had broken the code, and they determined that the Japs were headed towards Midway, and there would be a diversionary force headed toward the Aleutian Islands, which would strike at the same time. What the Japs had planned, we found out later, was by a diversionary force in the Aleutian Islands to attract some of the Navy fleet around Midway up in that area, thereby weakening the fleet around the fleet strength around Midway. Fortunately, the admirals in charge of the Navy around Midway were not fooled. They had the information, so they knew what was happening. About May 29th, we received word that the Japs are going to hit the Aleutian Islands between the 1st and 3rd of June 1942. Along about the 29th of May of 1942, the 77th was ordered down to a new secret base on the island of Umnak, which is the island just west of the island that has Dutch Harbor on its east end. Now, this base had been just put into effect about 2 weeks before this date of May 29th. We were called together in a room, and in this room, up at the head by the blackboard, stood a naval officer with an object in his hand about the size of a dinner plate and about 2 inches thick. On top were a lot of calibrations. Our commanding officer stood up and he said, "From now on, fellas, we're going to be torpedo bombers." Silence. We hadn't even seen a torpedo. We didn't know what torpedoes were insofar as we were concerned. But here we were now going to be carriers of Navy 2,000-pound torpedoes. And then he pointed to the Navy officer and said, "Now, Lieutenant so-and-so will explain to you how to operate a torpedo sight." This officer stood up and held up before us this drum-like object and said, this is a torpedo sight. And of course, we were duly impressed. He said, "Now, if you just take this and work these calibrations around the top here, this will be mounted in front of the co-pilot. He does the sighting." And after about 15 minutes, he says, "Are there any questions?" Well, there were no questions. Obviously, who would ask questions in front of the CO? So with that, the Navy lieutenant picked up his gear, walked out, and went back to Kodiak Island, Naval Air Base down there. And we were now instant torpedo bombers. He had told us that when we get down to Umnak, there we'll see 6 torpedoes ready for us. The Navy will install them on our planes. At that time, we hadn't even seen one up in Anchorage. So we left understanding that we were now torpedo bombers, not knowing anything about it. And this led to one fatality which could have been avoided. He failed to tell us that when you drop a torpedo from a height of about 50, 75 feet, that it has to travel 75 yards in the water before it's armed. As soon as the Japs hit Dutch Harbor, we had a Captain Thornborough from the 73rd Squadron operating out of Cold Bay at this particular point with a torpedo. He took off, and in the snow and the ice and the bad weather, he came out over one of the Jap carriers, which was in that area. Well, we found by operating up there, we had to do what we did instantly because you would lose then the object of your attack in the bad weather. So thinking that, well, I'm up here at this height, maybe if I dive bomb this torpedo, maybe it'll arm itself. We hadn't understood that it had to be in the water to arm itself to get the propeller, to have the propeller on the back of the torpedo unwind itself, thereby arming itself. He dove, he dived bombed the torpedo into the middle deck of the carrier, and of course it didn't go out. Captain Thornborough came back to Cold Bay, and above and beyond the call of duty, he said, "I want some 500-pound bombs." They flew him in. He took off again to find his fleet. Of course, by that time the fleet had withdrawn. The last we heard of him was a couple of distress signals farther on up the chain. Several weeks later, we found wreckage of his plane, which had crashed in the darkness. Had he known that there are 75 yards to travel as far as his torpedo is concerned, perhaps the outcome of that particular mission may have been different. But this was just one of the many areas in which we were thoroughly unprepared at this time in the history of this country for this war, such as no maps, such as not knowing how to handle that type of operation with the torpedoes. Meantime, the Japs were operating both north and south of Dutch Harbor. They would park their fleet, which amounted at that time 2 carriers, a couple of heavy cruisers, some destroyers, and 5 troop ships loaded with troops. About the 3rd or 4th day, we began to get B-17s and B-24s up the chain, and we had some down there at Almac. We had more at Cold Bay, which had a little bigger strip at that particular time. And so they began to see again, that is, the Jets began to see these heavier bombers coming in, both from the west and from the east. About the 6th or 7th day, they withdrew this whole force with which they, as we understood, were going to attack and land a landing force at Dutch Harbor and take over that fine naval base. They withdrew then to Kiska and to Attu, where they remained, as you well know, until the end of the Aleutian War in the spring of 1943, when they were driven out by landing of our U.S. Army landing forces and the like.